Good morning, and welcome everybody to this session on the Save Our Soil conference. Today we're going to be talking to a group of farmers from around the UK, and I'll introduce them in a minute. And if you've got any questions for the farmers, then please post them in the Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen, and some of them will be coming back to answer those questions later on in a panel that Mark Shaler is going to chair. So let me introduce my fellow panelists this morning. So we have nearest to me in terms of geographically, Neil Heseltine over in Malham in the Yorkshire Dales, who farms sheep and beef. David Lord, who has 700 hectares of mainly arable in northeast Essex. And Adam Driver from West Suffolk. That's the second time I've fluffed on that. Sorry, Adam. Who is mainly arable and a little bit of contract farming, but all combinable crops. So thanks everyone for taking the time out of your busy days. We on the agenda, we also had Ian O'Reilly from Gazegill Farm over in Lancashire. Unfortunately, Ian's just sent us a message to say he's in the middle of a farmer drama with a cow down and he's waiting for the vet, but he should be with us in the panel discussion later. So if you've got any questions specifically for Ian O'Reilly at Gazegill Farm, then please post those and we'll try and catch up with those later. So let's start by introducing everybody properly with a photo of their farm and ask each of them to describe their farm in 2 sentences and what first sparked each of your interests in regenerative agriculture. So if we could start with you, Adam, down in West Suffolk.
Hi, everyone. So my 2 sentences to describe the farm. I've put profitable and productive farming with resilience and ecology at the heart of what we do. Reducing our reliance on bought-in solutions whilst finding solutions in the soil biology and wider ecology of the farm. And I'll be honest, what sparked my view of my interest in regenerative farming was to make more money. That's what started it.
Good stuff. Thanks, Adam. And some good words in there that I like to use when I'm talking about circular economy as well, particularly resilience. So David, how about you?
Thanks, Catherine. Yep. So we're on the northeast Essex coast. It seems to be normally very dry, but recently we've been having very wet winters. We normally average 600 mil a year of rain. What sparked my interest really is about 2013, 2014. Everything was just coming to a head. It was a perfect storm. A lot of challenges coming our way, and the soil seemed to be at the centre of all the solutions to them.
Great, thank you, David. And Neil, how about you?
Thanks very much, Catherine, and good morning all. I'm going to take a few more than 2 sentences, if that's all right. I'll try and cover it in a couple of minutes, if that's all right. But thanks very much for inviting me along today, and thanks, Catherine, for the introduction. Catherine said, I'm Neil Heseltine, live and farm at Hilltop Farm in the village of Malham on the southern edge of the Yorkshire Dales National Park. Very much family-run farm, very much an upland farm, typical of the Dales. And all the derogatory designations you can get to describe the farm all apply to us. So a less favoured area, severely disadvantaged, above the moorland line. So not great in agricultural terms, but we are in a national park. So kind of to summarise, it's beautiful to look at, but not so easy to farm. And kind of ironically, all those designations could all work in our favour as we move towards environmental land management, but who knows on that. And we have livestock, as you see in the picture, that are suited to that environment and those surroundings. Belted Galloway and actually Rigget Galloway cattle more recently. And we have Swaledale sheep and more recently Wensleydale sheep, and that's mainly for their wool. But I think if we go back sort of nigh on 20 years, I was a very conventional mindset in my ambition and my approach to farming. And it was with the introduction of the Belted Galloways as part of a cattle conservation grazing scheme that we had our head turned really with regard to farming with nature and within natural processes. And to that point, we've almost gone sort of full circle in that the nature element on the farm is equally, if not more important than as the food we produce. And our ambition and our aim now is to produce food from the farm, obviously, but that has to be produced in a way that has a responsibility towards climate change and is helping to create and produce more natural habitats on the farm, all at the same time. But it also gives us as a family both a living, as Adam has suggested, but also a life. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Neil. And that's interesting that you say the nature element is now as important as the food, and I'm guessing that with your and we can come back to some of this later, but I'm guessing that your comment about it's given you a life as well as a livelihood is perhaps to do with that extra connection to nature and feeling that you're doing the right thing for nature in farming terms, and not just kind of being pushed down a route of having to farm as directed by policy or the profit motive.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to look at it in the whole. We sort of set out, I guess, looking at things from an environmental perspective. As I said, we were starting to see some of the results that the Belties were giving us in terms of, that was a cattle conservation grazing scheme. We were starting to see some of the biodiversity return on the farm as a result of that. And so we're starting to understand a little bit better that if we did things slightly differently on the farm to what we had done previously, then we got different results in terms of biodiversity. And that kind of, that's twofold, because you sort of start to see that you can benefit, but you also start to see that certain grazing and certain grazings at the wrong time of year, and in some cases with the wrong species at the wrong time of year, has a detrimental impact upon the environment. And so we were starting to see that sort of biodiversity return, and that was really fulfilling for us, and really that, as I say, that's almost become as important part or as important a part of what we do as the actual food we produce.
Great, thank you, Neil. And just to go back to you, Adam, you mentioned being profitable and productive, resilient, but also ecology driving the kind of the reason for doing what you're doing, and perhaps for sparking your interest. Do you want to expand on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I suppose when you first start looking into all this sort of thing, you see cost reduction, and people say you can keep your yields the same, you can reduce your inputs, all that kind of thing. So obviously, we're combinable crops growers, we grow commodities, so as low a cost as possible to make money, basically, at the moment. That's how it is at the moment anyway. And the more I've got into it, the more I've learned, the more I realise that profitability, ecology, and all those kinds of things all just work together.
Yeah, it's all inextricably linked.
It's not a fight. It becomes less of a fight. We've been farming as the solutions, the bought-in solutions. They don't work. A lot of them don't work anymore, or they're being revoked, all that kind of thing. And it's just a constant treadmill to try and keep on top of things. And we've seen what's happened with various crops. So we've got to work out the answers for ourselves, really, work them out together as farmers, and try not to buy them in because they're expensive.
Yeah. There's a slide from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that I've used in my got in the pack for my webinar later, and that points out that since the 1960s, yields have gone up 85%, but the cost of that in terms of these bought-in inputs has been massive. So fertilizer use up by a factor of 4, pesticide use up by a factor of 38 times. So we've not even doubled yield, but we've put 38 times more pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, and all the rest into the system, and then doubling the amount of land globally that's under irrigation. So it's yes, it's a significant improvement in yields compared to the last several hundred number of centuries, but wow, what a cost. And David, what about you? You talked about the challenges of lots more rain over the last year, and how's that affected the soil and the ecology, and your kind of view of how regenerative farming could help you be more resilient.
Well, yeah, I mean, I mentioned about the soil being at the heart of so many of the solutions we need, and addressing the issues with weather volatility is a massive part of it. We're generally known as sort of the drier part of Britain, But like everyone else, the last couple of autumns, we've had it very, very wet. We're wanting to drill our autumn cereals in the month of October, and that's been sort of the wettest month the last 2 years. But we've noticed that the ability of the soil to handle we're direct sowing our crops, and the ability of the soil to handle the traffic passing over it once with the drill is so much better when with our system of regenerative agriculture. We're able to get crops in, and they're able to keep their potential. But that said, where we haven't managed to get crops in because it's been too wet, the soil's in a good place to get through the winter, hopefully with a living root in it. And then come the spring, we're able to plant something when it's dry enough, and we don't have that hangover from drilling into wet conditions, which if you've cultivated a field and drilled into it, that you've got long-term implications on the condition of the soil then. So it's definitely made us more resilient to the weather, as well as all the financial resilience which Adam was talking about.
So just to make sure people who are new to regenerative farming kind of understand that, you're talking about building soil health, so there's more organic matter in the soil and so on, which makes it its ability to stand up to being drilled better, and its ability to hold the water is better as well. But are you also talking about what's called no-till approaches, so direct drilling instead of ploughing and then putting the seed in the furrows?
Very much so, yeah. We've found we had a system before we went direct drilling where we would cultivate to a depth of sort of 6 to 8 inches. We moved away from that, and we use cover crops in between our our cash crops to condition the soil and keep it living. And we treat it as a living, it is a living ecosystem. It needs looking after, it needs feeding, and cultivation is inherently bad for it. The biological processes which we need to be working in the soil are badly damaged by cultivation. So minimizing the amount of cultivation we can do is a good thing. We sometimes do have to do a cultivation, but it's just keeping that to a minimum.
And cover crops are one of the other key approaches, aren't they, to regenerative agriculture? So making sure there's no bare soil and picking crops that can go in between the kind of planned saleable crops, if you like, but picking cover crops that can bring in missing nutrients that might have been taken out of the soil by whatever the previous crop was.
Yeah, it's hard to sometimes when you do a paper-based exercise on cover crops, it can be quite hard to quantify the good things that they actually do, because there's so many of them, and trying to pull it all in to get a sort of financial outcome from it can be quite hard. But we've seen with our own eyes and the difference it makes to the system. It would be really hard to do what we're doing without using cover crops.
That's interesting. And so, David, to kind of continue on that, what's your vision for regenerative agriculture on your farm? Where do you want to see the farm being in a few years' time?
Well, we're on a trend now of reducing our fertilizer use and reducing our pesticide use. I can't see us ever using no fertilizers or no pesticides. I think there'll always be a need for something, but we're very much reducing those needs. I'd like that to carry on. And I mean, my vision really is to keep working with nature, to be as productive as I can, because the business has got to make money. But we're very much realizing now that nature means business. We've got to, we've got to work with it to make our businesses resilient and profitable.
And do you see the potential for animal-based manures to replace bought-in fossil-based fertilizers? Well,
that's the next sort of natural step for us is to incorporate. Probably incorporate's the wrong word, isn't it? Integrate livestock into our system. We used to have a dairy herd here up until the late 90s, but like many dairy herds in this part of the world, that went by the wayside for financial reasons. But we need to get, livestock as we go forward, and if we really want to reduce fertilizer use, if we really want to sink carbon into the soil, if we want to, if we really want to turbocharge the system, which we know works, then we're going to need livestock as part of it. And for me, as a purebred arable farmer, that's a significant challenge to me in terms of skill set and infrastructure, and marketing, and that's going to be a big step for us, but one I think we need to take.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. And Adam, what about you? What's your vision for where regenerative agriculture could take you and the farm?
I'd echo what David said pretty much. He took the words out of my mouth, and I get what we're saying about livestock as well. Personally, I love the idea of getting livestock back onto the farm or the farms. We're farming land for other people as well. So whether they'd be keen on that, I don't know. But personally, I'd rather try and do some kind of joint venture with someone who actually knows what they're doing in terms of livestock. I don't want to go near if a sheep came up to me, I'd run away. I'm an arable farmer. I don't want to get my hands dirty. So I think some sort of collaboration, joint venture with someone would be quite an exciting thing in the future.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I've just been, as we were talking about a bit earlier, I just finished reading the book by James Rebanks, his second book in English Pastoral, and I'd wondered, when you hear all these conversations about methane from cows and all the issues particularly with cattle farming, I'd wondered whether that was the same for, pasture-fed cattle versus cattle that are largely reared indoors and fed silage and soy and other stuff that they've probably not evolved to digest. And in James Rebanks' book, he talks about a local farmer who's putting slurry from his cow sheds on his fields, but it's so acidic that it kills off the grass that's there. And so, it's another question, isn't it, about what we're feeding animals these days if we're putting them into an intensive system, and whether that's what they should be eating. And because we're using various approaches to try and make their outputs more productive and more cost effective, are we in fact messing with their not just their quality of life in terms of interest and well-being and living in conditions that they're happy with, but actually kind of force feeding them stuff that they're not bred to digest, and then wondering why the outputs aren't any good for the rest of the farm. That maybe I'm being too controversial there, but Neil, do you have any views on that as you're a livestock farmer?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, it was one of the things that we looked at really closely, as we'll see a little bit later on particularly on the sheep enterprise. We were going along quite merrily. We're pasture fed on the beef enterprise and always had been ever since we first got the cows, and we were pasture fed with the cattle, but not with the sheep. Very conventional with the sheep, feeding a lot of concentrates actually. And one of the things we had to look at was it wasn't really comparing the methane with it wasn't really looking at the comparisons in methane between pasture-fed or none, but it was really just the fact that we're dragging crops from all over the world, Brazilian soya, potentially GM crops from the US, to feed our sheep in Malham, and that didn't seem to make a great deal of sense. And there's obviously a carbon emissions from doing all that, and then you have no idea what the criteria, what conditions those crops are being grown at, where they're being, where they're at source. So all sorts of sort of environmental issues with feeding grain to anything really, and like you say, the methane stuff is also part of that. But can I just come back to another point you made earlier on as well, Catherine? Just in terms of just in terms of productivity, and over the last sort of 40 or 50 years, as you said, we've increased in productivity, and yield has been sort of key and crucial to what we've been trying to achieve. And actually that productivity has gone up massively, as you said, over probably about 50 years really. But at the same time, profitability, as you alluded to, has gone down over that same period of time. So we've been going for productivity in that direction, and all the time profitability has been going like that, and they're almost inversely proportional to each other. And yet still within our sort of mindset, and we'll possibly come on to it later on, within our mindset it still seems to be about yield in a lot of areas of the farming world. And I just think that's probably one lesson we need to learn, is that productivity doesn't necessarily always give us more profitability. In fact, like I say, the converse is probably true.
Yeah, I quite agree. And I think, well, you know, I wonder whether a lot of that is fostered by the, you know, the companies profiting from selling us the inputs. They're the ones who've got us focused on yield being the number one driver of whether you're a successful farm or not.
Yeah.
And, you know, and so everybody's on this kind of constant quest for, how do I up my yields? Well, it's got to be by you know, more inputs or different inputs or whatever. And actually we're all kind of heading in the wrong direction, down a slippery slope. So Neil, just to come back and finish on that question, what about, you know, you've made a lot of changes, a lot of progress over the last number of years, kind of, you know, the figures that we'll look at later, you talk about comparisons with 2012. So, you know, you're heading towards a decade now or so. What's your vision for where regenerative agriculture could take you and the farm at Malham?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we necessarily regard ourselves or call ourselves regenerative farmers. We don't necessarily do all the sort of fancy grazing techniques that are out there at the moment, but we definitely feel that we are generally, our sort of, what we're trying to do is we are trying to regenerate things, and whatever that may be is fine by us. In this sort of same way, we are certified organic. We're heavily involved with the Pasture Fed Livestock Association, have been for sort of 10 years or so. Heavily involved with the Nature Friendly Farming Network, which is where I know David from. And we absolutely agree with kind of all those principles and those philosophies, and we apply them all to the farm in a varying degrees. But I believe you do have to treat each farm individually, because as we know, every farm is different in every way. But probably most importantly, the aspirations of the individuals within those farms is very different. So we have to take that into account. And you know, for us, and probably what my vision is regarding regenerative agriculture, it's as much about what we wanted as a family out of life as much as what we wanted for the farm. So obviously you're trying to cover your economic and your environmental sustainability, but the social sustainability is an important factor in the vision I have for regenerative farming.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Could you unpack that a bit for us? I mean, are you talking about interaction with the local community, with customers, with, you know, finding people who want to work on the farm because it's more fulfilling? What do you mean by the social impact?
What it encapsulates all those things you've mentioned. You know, local community, people working, getting people involved in what we're doing is becoming increasingly important to us. Also, we have a lot of visitors to Malham. We're in a national park, so incorporating what we do as a farm and how we produce our food is really important to that. We do quite a lot of social media work, and there seems to be a particular tie-up between the people that come to the holiday cottage and the Instagram account, and that when they arrive at holiday cottage, they're particularly interested in what's going on the farm, because they've sort of already seen that story on Instagram. But what I really mean by that, about the social sustainability, is making a life for the farmers themselves. What I don't want to do with regenerative agriculture is deal with the economic and the environmental aspects of it, but still see farmers working 70, 80 hours a week, still working really hard. And in some instances at the moment, that's for a fairly meager return. So, you know, I think we have to deal with that as an industry. And if that's regenerative agriculture that's dealing with that, then we go along that route, and it becomes part of what we're actually trying to deliver as an industry. So that element of it. So we try to create an industry which is relevant to today and modern life.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm seeing more and more surveys showing how, you know, people are changing their own behaviour, markedly more so over the course of the pandemic, with people wanting to focus on being more sustainable in their own lives. And I think that's, you know, and they're kind of shocked when they find out that businesses aren't necessarily operating on those principles. I think there's, there is a lot more interest now in pasture-fed meat. I've got some stats in my webinar about the increase in retail purchases of free-range eggs. So sales more than doubling over 15 years, and up to over 2/3 now in the UK is free range. And so I think if more people kind of understood, the benefits of pasture-fed livestock for for the well-being of the animals, then that could really be a way to engage more customers who are interested in perhaps having a bit less of something, but knowing when they do have it that they've done the right thing for planet and nature, as well as the farmer. And so, Neil, perhaps now's a good time to, because I remember when we first met, you shared some financial calculations that you'd done, taken a few years after you'd started to change your approach, and you've kindly sent us that slide. So maybe we could ask Amy to share that now, and you could talk us through it.
Okay. Thanks, Catherine. So we were merrily going along with a few belties on the farm. We sort of belty enterprise, which were conservation grazers, and we also had a sheep enterprise on the farm, which we very much regarded as the main enterprise on the farm, both in terms of my work commitments, but also the sort of return we got from that, or the return we thought we got. And we were seeing the cattle enterprise developing, both financially and we were starting to see that grazing in a different way created different results in terms of biodiversity on the farm. We were starting to get involved with the PFLA, ORFC, and they were opening our eyes to sort of different ways of farming, and we were starting to see the benefits of that in terms of biodiversity on the farm and what that was bringing. And that sort of, in turn, like I said previously, that almost in turn gave us some concerns about the sheep enterprise, both the environmental impact, so the grazing impact of the sheep enterprise, but as we mentioned earlier, feeding lots of concentrates which were coming from all over the world, so the sort of environmental impact of that, but also in terms of my commitment on the farm, in terms, both mentally and physically. So it was really, but on the converse of that, we knew that it was bringing in about 60 grand, as the figures suggest, whereas the cattle were only bringing in about, sort of towards 20,000. So you sort of think, well, it is the main enterprise, so, and we have concerns about it, but what do we do about that? And it was really just a case of saying, well, we've just got to look at things much more closely, and this is what we found. So as you can see, in 2012, although it was bringing in sort of 60,000, the sheep enterprise, the actual margin at the end of the day, the contribution to us was 478 quid, which is around about 15 pence an hour, which didn't really make a great deal of sense. And so we just took the decision to change that, to halve the number, and really just learn the lessons from the cattle enterprise to make it more extensive and to take all the cost out of that. So that's kind of what we did. And then so the other figures are from 2016, where the sort of margin that we're getting from the sheep enterprise with half the number of sheep is obviously far greater. And so, from our perspective, that was we had 4 wins out of that. It was sort of lower grazing pressure, so you're getting an environmental benefit from that, less bought in feed, less of my time involved with it, and a greater margin to boot. So and these figures have now been sort of repeated over the next 5 years. And so we're just in a much better place, both as a farm and as a family, as a result of reducing the number of sheep we had on the farm.
Thank you. And those figures are, pretty amazing, aren't they? So, Adam, what about you? What are the key benefits that you've seen for the farm, for your customers, for the community, and also for nature?
For the farm, obviously the usual reduction of bills, reduction of inputs, that kind of thing. I haven't really thought of it too much in terms of social, but actually, since we've been doing what we're doing, you seem to have engaged a lot of the local people. They seem to be really interested. They're asking questions, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Some of the other local farmers are more like, why on earth are you doing that? But a lot of the local people are asking lots of questions. They're very interested in, why, we're drilling wheat into big, thick cover crops, big, 3-4 foot high cover crops, and it's things that people have never seen before, and they're quite fascinated by it, and they're like, how's that going to grow? And I just say, well, give it 6 months, and you'll actually see it, because the stuff still, if you still look at it from the wrong angle now, you can't see it. And I know it's there and it looks good, but so I put signs out for people to try and explain what we're doing and why we're doing it. Environmentally, there's a lot more worms, a lot more beetles, a lot more beneficial insects. I haven't done any proper counts of anything, because I don't really have the patience for that kind of thing. It's really a job for someone who's really interested in that kind of thing to do. We've got more owls, we've got more birds in general. There just seems to be more about, there's more English partridge, there just seems to be more wildlife about, some more skylarks and all that kind of thing. And our farm was in no way sort of devoid of life before we went down this. My father's always farmed very consciously with looking after the soil, and that's probably why it's working. We've transitioned so easily, I suppose. But we're definitely seeing more and more as we move on, which is pleasing.
Fantastic, thanks, Adam. And David, how about you? What changes and benefits have you noticed?
Yeah, some interesting parallels there with Adam, actually. I mean, environmentally, yeah, loads. Certainly more bird life is the really noticeable thing, and as the top end of the ecosystem, that's always a good indicator. Especially this time of year, we see, because we're on the coast here, we see an awful lot of waders using our cover crops. You don't know they're there till you walk through it. But in terms of consumers, it's an interesting one, because I mean, Adam and I are commodity producers, and so we've got a disconnect between what we produce and the people that eat our produce, which you don't necessarily have to the same degree with livestock production. And so I tend to look as consumers as more like society, if you like, and however you farm, there's always going to be an environmental cost to that farming. Whatever system of farming you have is always going to offset nature to a degree. It might be a very small degree, or it might be a very big degree, depending how you farm. And I tend to think, the way that we are farming is reducing that environmental offset, which has to be a good thing for society as a whole, because we are, we're addressing biodiversity issues, we're addressing pollution issues, and things like that as part of the system. So that's kind of the way I look at it.
Thank you. And are any of you noticing a change in the kind of the conversations, in terms of when people are asking you why you're doing this and what the benefits are? Obviously, nature and biodiversity is a big one, and that more people are realizing now that that's just as big as an emergency as climate. But are people starting to have conversations with you about the benefits for locking up carbon in soil, or is that still a bit too fringe, do you think, the knowledge around that?
I think that stuff is there is a lot of talk of that stuff, and I have spoken to people about it. It is coming, I think, but it's learning how to measure it. I'm a bit dubious about locking into something this early on that we don't really know about. I'm trying to learn more about it, basically, until I feel comfortable with it. But I think that there is markets for that kind of thing now.
Yeah, I mean, intuitively, it feels right and it feels logical, doesn't it? But you're right. How would you measure that, and how would you kind of what there might be dangers in providing financial incentives to do that, or offsetting, buying offsets through farming and that kind of thing. So it could be difficult.
It's all quite early days on it, so it's a bit. I know people are doing it, and I'm interested, but I just just need to be a bit careful and watch it and try and learn and see what's going on, really.
Sure. And David, Neil, do you want to make a comment on that?
I can come in if you want. I think Adam makes a really good point, actually. Especially with the carbon sequestration stuff, and people will argue with me on this, but there's so many different metrics out there, so many different ways of measuring it, or supposedly measuring it. I'm not sure we've got a great deal of fact on that yet. David might have some more information on that. I don't know, but so I think we're right to sort of hold that at arm's length at the moment and really understand it and really know whether we are being beneficial before we go full length into that. And that actually might be more relevant to the arable guys than myself. We don't necessarily look at the soil in quite the same way as these guys do, but what we probably look at more is biodiversity and nature habitats and creating those natural habitats. And we're probably quite lucky that we're on limestone land, which is quite unique in what you can produce, if that's the right word, or create. And we're definitely having more conversations with both our customers and the local community about that, and there is definitely an appetite and an interest in that.
Great. And David, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a carbon audit on the farm here. We've used a couple of carbon calculators, and it's worthwhile doing, just to get your head around what the major contributors are, if you like. I mean, our major one is nitrogen fertilizer. That would be the same for most conventional arable farmers, I'd have thought. So it gives you somewhere to focus on, but also, as I say, just to get your mind around thinking about that way. That way of thinking, when carbon crediting does come, you've already got some sort of baseline, something to work from, and you're sort of going into it eyes open a bit more. But as Adam and Neil have said, it's still, I think there's a couple of companies which are hoping to start things up this year, but I think most people will just be watching and waiting. And certainly from our point of view, most of our soils have got reasonable organic matter in them. So to increase it further, I said earlier, I think we're going to need a grazing element. And something I'd just like to say, sort of ask Neil actually, is, as a lowland farm needing livestock, is there potential for his system and my system to integrate, or is that distance too much? Is there potential there? I mean, I know there's always been a sort of historical movement of livestock from upland to lowland areas.
I absolutely think there's ways that lowland farms and upland farms can work together. Like you say, historically, that's how it always worked. The lamb sales that used to take place in Malham were at the end of August, and they would just take place in the village. It'd be all the weather lambs just gathered off the hills, and they'd be sold on to lowland farms. The distance between me and you might be a little bit great for that, but yeah, there's definitely, and there's a lot of livestock farmers who would take your hand off at that, David. And there's definitely appetite to work together, and we should be working together in exactly that way.
Good stuff.
Can I just come back on something though on the carbon stuff? Like you said, Catherine, both the carbon, climate change and nature collapse, or whichever word you want to use, are massive issues for global society at the moment. And I do think there is a massive opportunity for farming there, in that if we can show evidence that we can capture carbon, and we can show evidence that we can farm and produce food in amongst creating natural habitats and promoting wildlife at the same time, then I do think that sort of joint or balanced production of food production, mitigating climate change and creating wildlife habitats, really does present a massive opportunity for us as farmers, as an industry. But as Adam has said, or Adam and David have said, we've got to be able to show evidence that is true before we can really start shouting that. But if we can do that, then that is a huge opportunity for us as a farming industry.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And just to mention another stat in my webinar, using some figures from Mike Berners-Lee over in Lancashire, who wrote a book 2019, There's No Planet B. So he goes through the world food system, and he looks at the food that we're growing, including food for livestock and food for humans, on the basis of calories per person per day. So what we're producing every day divided by, in calorie terms, divided by the number of people. And we're producing 4 times as many calories as we need to feed the people on Earth. And so, there's a big chunk of it lost in waste, a big chunk of it lost in kind of what we feed to livestock, including 740 calories. So that's 2/3 of what it takes to feed a human that's going into feeding livestock. And I'm guessing, and that's human edible crops. That's not counting the pasture stuff. So there's an awful lot of crops being grown specifically for livestock, who then don't do a very good job of converting them into calories. And then there's, you know, crops going for biofuels as well. That's getting on for 10%. And so there's, you know, there's lots of choices that we can make to make the whole system work much more effectively for us and for all the animals, you know, livestock and nature, all involved in it. And so one of the other questions I wanted to ask you all was about the barriers that you've come up against since you've started moving towards regenerative agriculture. So any barriers or key threats that you see kind of looming on the horizon? David, perhaps if we could start with you.
So, I mean, for me personally, we went into it and started doing it in 2014, and there was, I would say, slightly less uncertainty around farming and agricultural policy at that point. If I was going into it now, the uncertainty, I mean, I know talking to a lot of fellow arable farmers, the uncertainty is really holding people back. You know, we've had the issue with Brexit and what our new trading situation is going to be, and also probably larger than that is how our new domestic agricultural policy is going to play out, and what it's going to reward people to do. And I get the sense there's a lot of people which are just holding back at the moment and just seeing which direction things are going to go in before they commit to change. When we first started, we did get a few sort of raised eyebrows as to what we were doing, and a few, you know, sort of funny looks, if you like. But actually, as time has gone on, the majority of farmers have engaged with what we're doing. They're really interested. I don't think the fear of change is there so much of change itself. I think it's the uncertainty which is probably the biggest barrier that there's been.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. And Adam, what's your view on the barriers and potential threats putting people off?
So similar to David, you know, just to start with, other local farmers were sort of, what on earth are you doing? And now they're asking how to do it, or how we've done it. But other barriers, threats, elms is a big threat, actually, I think, even though it could be, hopefully they design it so it works well within how we're farming. But as someone who's mainly contract farming and renting land, I need to compete with what they offer, which is, you know, which is quite a big prospect. And again, the uncertainty, we don't know what's happening with that. But we're farming in this way. We think it's the right way to go. We're getting on with it. We've just cracked on with it, to be honest. We once you know something can work and you've proved it, then you do need to just pull the trigger and get on with it. We can't keep sort of trying a bit here, trying a bit there, which I think often happens, you know, or you know, with these no-till regenerative systems, and I'm guilty of this in the past. You know, you try a field or whatever and it goes wrong, and people instantly blame the system. Whereas I've come to realise there's nothing wrong with the system. When I've had fields go wrong, it's my fault, down to my bad management or my lack of knowledge or experience or whatever. So that's how I'm trying to change my mindset, and hopefully other people will start to realise that, you know, if people have a field that fails after a plough, they don't blame the plough. But if a no-till field fails, it's a system. But very occasionally it might be, but usually it's a mistake the management has made, and I've made them, and learned hopefully from them.
And I guess this is one of the big challenges, isn't it, that we've been following the system of fossil-based inputs for so long that everybody's got used to it, and the knowledge and the skills of doing it differently and working with nature, you know, they've been left to be forgotten by an awful lot of of farmers, and particularly if you're sort of relatively new to this, then it's kind of where do you get the knowledge from? It's I don't think it's necessarily being taught in agricultural colleges, and a lot of the kind of if we like traditional knowledge hasn't been passed down.
I'd say that the knowledge and the resources are out there. You just have to go and dig around for it. There's loads of stuff on YouTube, especially over the last 5 or 6 years. Before that, it was a bit scant. It would have been hard to really go full hog into it. But now there's more and more people doing it. There's loads of stuff on YouTube, loads of books to read. But again, you have to go and look for it yourself and find it and digest that information yourself, rather than just paying an advisor to tell you, an agronomist or whatever, telling you what chemical to put on, what fertilizer to put on. You've got to try and take it and learn yourself, really.
Yeah.
You have to do it anyway.
Yeah, and try it out on your farm in your conditions.
Yeah.
And Neil, what about from a livestock perspective? What do you see as the barriers and threats?
Yeah, I think Adam made a really good point where when I sort of suppose we're seen as experimenting, and people are quite happy to blame the system or what you're experimenting with when something goes wrong, rather than because things go wrong in all types of farming. People are quick to jump on that. But I think you're also right, Catherine, in that it's a learning process, and we're still absolutely learning skills and going through that learning process, watching animals behave when they behave in a natural environment and they're allowed to exhibit that natural behavior. They behave in a completely different way, and we're absolutely learning from that. But so it is an experimental and learning process. I think back with the sort of barriers, I think in the outset it was my own mindset and my own sort of mentality, as it were, that sort of held me back for a little while, breaking out of the conventional mindset. I'd been trained at agricultural college and worked on a lot of sort of farms throughout the late 80s and 90s, and so I had a very much a conventional mindset, and breaking myself out of that is and it is a difficult process. In terms of the other farming community, I think certainly in the livestock sector, and certainly in north of England, I think the farming community sees a lot of self-worth, and rightly so, in producing brilliant stock and producing food to a certain extent, and breaking away from that is really difficult. But from my perspective, I don't see us going down a different route or a regenerative route as actually challenging that. I still think people can produce amazing livestock through these systems as well. So personally, I don't see that as a challenge, but I think that mindset is there within the farming community. But I think the biggest barriers really are a fear of risk, as David and Adam have both touched on, and that's particularly prevalent at the moment, and also just a fear of change. And us going through the process we did with the financials really helped us, but I think that's a real big barrier to people changing, and that sort of fear of change is a real big barrier.
So moving on from that then, Neil, what would be your top tip for any farmer wanting to get started, having heard a bit about what's happening at Save Our Soils conference and maybe read a bit of stuff? How would you suggest they get started?
I think for us, I think having looked back now, we wish we'd done it earlier. We wish we'd had the sort of courage of our conviction to go with it sooner, and we just wish we'd had a little bit more belief in ourselves and been a bit braver. And we were letting other people's expectations of what we should be doing affected our decision making. And so I would say, be yourself, be individual, both in your approach, and be individual, as you've said, Catherine, that it's your individual farm, and do what's right for that farm. Don't be afraid to experiment. It's very much a sort of fluid and a continuous process, and you're going to make mistakes along the way, as Adam said, or you're going to get things wrong, and things are going to go wrong. But that's what happens, and if you back yourself, then that'll be fine. I think, as I sort of alluded to earlier, do what's right for you and do what's right for your family. It's important that they're part of it, and you, at some point, you've just got to take the leap of faith. And for us, it's been a really exciting process to go down a different route. It's been a really liberating process in a lot of ways, and extremely enjoyable. And we get as much, if not more, out of the farm now than we ever used to. So yeah, just you'll never look back. Just take that leap of faith.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. And Adam, how about you? What words of advice would you give to someone wanting to get started in regenerative approaches?
Get on with it. To be honest, I think with what's going to happen in agriculture and what's going on, just get on with it. The resources are there, go look for them and crack on. There's enough people in the country who do way longer than me who are making it work. So, you know, it's all on different soils everywhere. So get on with it and back yourself.
Great stuff. Thank you. And David, how about you?
Yeah. I mean, I've yet to meet a regenerative farmer who doesn't like talking about what he does. It's a really positive experience in lots of different ways. So phone up your nearest person who you think's doing it, or you know, there's loads of organisations out there. You know, you've you know, as well as Nature Friendly Farming Network, you've got BASE, you've got the Game Wildlife Conservancy Trust. There's LEAF. AHDB are starting to do a lot more on this now. It's getting engaged, and I mean the key to I've found for me is knowledge exchange between farmers. That's been the biggest sort of boost to what I've done. It's given me confidence to do things, and just engaging with other farmers and comparing and contrasting what you're doing. So that would be my tip. I mean, with the groundswell show, I mean, let's hope. I think Boris has said it can happen now. So you know, let's hope it happens. And you know, that's a great place to go. The last time I was there, I was meeting farmers from my local area, and I would never have imagined that they were going there, but they were there, just finding out and learning stuff. And yeah, that's the key to it. It's just getting out there, like Adam says, just get on with it.
Great stuff. And just to throw in a bit of a curveball to you all at the end, and I'll come back to Neil first on this, because I suspect he's already got views. If you were talking to you know, top politicians, what policy would you most want them to put in place as part of, you know, ELMS or something else? What policy change would you think would make the biggest difference?
I think for me, Catherine, it goes back to kind of what I said before. The biggest, probably the biggest issue that global society faces at the moment is climate change and nature decline, and I do think that we as an industry have a potential to really address both of those, and we can produce food at the same time. I know there's a lot of thoughts that we have to produce in a certain amount of food, but as you said, there's other things we can address, like food waste and how much we eat and various other things before we actually need to think about the amount of food we're producing. So if we can produce food and we can mitigate climate change, or play our part and be responsible towards climate change and create nature habitats and reverse that decline in nature, then that's what I'd be saying to politicians, to create an ELMS system that rewards that, and rewards that fairly, I would say.
Okay, thank you. And David, what would your number one policy change request be?
So similar to what Neil has said, really, we need a policy that works with food production. We've got to get away from this, and we are, I think, getting away from this, seeing the environment as one thing and food production as another thing. The two can work together. They need to work together, and so any policy needs to, you know, incorporate that into our farming systems. Thank
you. And Adam, any final thoughts from you on policy?
Yeah, very similar to the other guys, really. I got this sort of idea of whole farm ecology. You know, all these stewardship things at the moment. You often see pictures, and there's a perfectly ploughed field that's had 300 kilos of N on it and 5 fungicides or whatever, and then there's a margin, and it's, look how great this is for the environment. But we know it can all be encompassed within the production system without losing production, and the whole thing should be encouraged to be working together, rather than that rubbish corner is a wildflower mix and this bit is crops grown with heavy tillage and ploughing and all, and loads of nitrogen and all that kind of thing. I just think everything should be entwined.
Because there's probably very little chance of the wildlife in that corner actually, you know, getting out to act as natural pest removers in the middle of that big field, is there?
But they won't get very far.
No, exactly. Great. Well, thank you, David, Adam, and Neil, for sharing all that knowledge and sharing your experiences with us this morning. It's been great. And thanks to the audience for your time in listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And if you've got any questions for Neil, Adam, and David, then please post those, and they'll well, Adam and David will be back at 1:40, perhaps with Ian O'Reilly from Gazegill Farm, to answer questions in a session chaired by Mark Shaler. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.